very wonderful author whom I just heard has been teaching for years.
And that was my past.
Your past, but you continue to teach us, Roseanne. And as you say to us, I've got a story, and it's a love story, Ann Kallister says. You call us to say, we do too. I come from roots, Syria, says Roseanne. Well, that calls us to realize we come from roots too, don't we? We don't just happen. And our roots call us to a story that is a love story, as Roseanne named. And it's always a story that gets mixed up in all kinds of challenges, but what emerges is the love, huh? Yeah. So do we want to go around and hear some, Roseanne, of some of the ethnic roots that are in this room?
If they'd like to mention their ethnic group, that would be fine, unless they want to get into it. It's up to you.
Yeah, it's up to you. Dana, you were going to tell us. You tell us.
And you want to talk into the microphone.
I think we're a small group. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Well, I thought I would tell a story about my ethnic roots. I was raised in Appalachia. I come from mainly a Scottish family, although on my mother's side we also have Belarus now is the country where my mother's grandfather came from, and English. But all of my childhood, I heard that my father's mother was part Native American. My father's father, long story, was married to 3 women sequentially. He had over 25 children. When my grandfather died, there were several hundred grandchildren. So, a huge family. And everybody thinks that they're Native American. Some of the older people say, I wonder if I'm enough of a percentage qualified to get special money or special taxation or whatever you can get. So a few years ago I did the 23andMe test. It turns out that my grandmother's mother was her stepmother.
Wow.
And nobody thought about that.
Wow. But here you are, and we are delighted. You have the last name that sounds German to me.
My husband is Lithuanian, and his father's name was about this long. And when his grandfather actually immigrated to the U.S. from Lithuania, they lived in an area in Massachusetts where everybody was from Lithuania. I did some geological research. And when my husband's father was in the military, of course, they didn't call him Grobowski, whatever it was. They just called him Grub. So he changed his name.
Grub. That's a good one. Huh? And it sounds very ethnic, does it not?
Oh, yes.
Anybody else have a story?
We want to hear her.
All right. And as we move to your story, Roseanne, coming from Syrian roots, you tell us how it is you're here.
Okay, I will.
Great. Now, I think that might be
Okay.
better. This one is not registering as well.
Well, I hope I can get it.
I'll get it. Okay.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, is this, can you
Yeah.
hear me
Yeah,
comfortably
that's
now? I tend to project a lot anyway, so if I get, if you feel as though I'm blasting you, you just say, okay, cool it, lady, cool it, okay. What I want to talk about today is my novel, which is called Sister of Sonoya. And the title Sister refers to the sister, the third youngest sister, who was born to this family in Sonoya, who got to leave Sonoya and come to the United States when her mother and father decided to come. Now, actually, however, I want to give you just a little bit of background about the Syrian Americans who came over at this time. My novel is really about the first Syrian Americans who came to this country and immigrated in the late 19th and 20th century. And those early Syrians were Christian Syrians who came to this country. Later on, about 20, 30, 40 years later, the immigration of Syrian Muslims began. So the reason I'm making this distinction is you will find that in my novel, I talk a lot about Catholic education, and Catholic education is a whole other ball of wax. Any Catholics here? Okay, so you know Catholic education is pretty, well, we can all do our various good things and diatribes about Catholic education. So that's the reason that you read a lot about Catholic education in that period of time in my novel. So the first Syrians who migrated to this country in the late 19th century and early 19th century were Christians. And they were running away from the Turks. Now, I have here that you can look at before you leave today. I have a map that shows the location of Syria, because as I found repeatedly, and as was true in my own background, I had an awful lot of people saying, well, where is Syria? You know, and it's difficult to explain where it is, but once you see the map, you get a better understanding of what was happening to the Syrian migration in the late 19th and early 20th century. And if you look at the map, you'll find that it's bordered by a number of significant places. Sure, you could pass that around. It's bordered by Turkey, it's bordered by Afghanistan, it's bordered by Iran, Israel is close by, etc. So you see, nowadays, when you're reading all this stuff in the newspaper about what's happening in a place called Idlib, Syria, for example, people will say to me, well, where in the devil is Idlib? Well, it's up in the northern corner of Syria. But unless you see these maps and you get an idea of where Syria is, you get you understand why it's so important, especially in what's happening now. Everybody wants their hands on Syria. It's a political grab, is what it is. And the people who are suffering as a result of it are the Syrians themselves. And one of the people that is making it hard for them is their president, Bashar. And his father before him, for 40 years, pretty much decimated and ruined that population. So the despotism is a historical one that began with his father, and he's doing a bang-up job on it now. There is another place in Syria that is called Sinoia, which is the little, Sinoia is the town that my heroine is from. And it is a significant town because it is many centuries old, and there is an ancient monastery there, supposedly begun by Justinian. Now, I can't tell you a whole lot about Justinian other than the fact that he founded that monastery, but there is a rich history behind it. There is also another town 30 miles away that is called Sinoia, and that holds the prison where President Bashar is hanging Syrian men literally by the hundreds daily. So that gives you some idea.
As in today.
Today.
Daily.
Yeah. So Syria is a historical grab on the part of a lot of people who want dominance there, like Iran, for example, like Israel, like Russia, who is subsidizing a lot of that. So it's hard to understand all of this until you realize what it is. Now, specifically, my story is the story of Nadra. It is who was a 12-year-old daughter of a Syrian family who left there in the early 19th century. She was 12 years old. She came to this country with dreams of education and opportunity. Very bright child. When she came here, her father made sure that she was the one in charge of the confectionery that he started. Consequently, she ended up working in the confectionery for the first 4 years of her life in this country. She didn't get the opportunity for education or anything else because he needed somebody to run the store, and his wife was too busy getting pregnant every year, so that's what happened to Nadra. Eventually, they married Nadra off at age 16 to a handsome young man called John. Together, their story is the love story that I want to talk about, which was not a serene, happy-go-lucky love story all the time, but it certainly started out that way in the beginning. They built their own confectionery, and they eventually lived a fairly rich life, or as rich as you could live it, you know, considering that they also had to go through the Depression and other things like that. Eventually, Nadra realizes that even though they loved each other dearly, there were enough differences between them to make things difficult. She always wanted education. She always wanted opportunity. She was the one, when John and she started their own confectionery, who knew how to run things, who knew how to make money, etc., etc. John was all right in those capacities until about the time the Depression kicked in, and then a lot of changes had to be made. Consequently, Nadra became somewhat disillusioned because her frustration at never having education, never having real opportunity, never really being able to exercise the main things that she wanted was holding her back. She eventually has a number of very close women friends who proved to be the big resource for her. So what she does is she starts a business with another man, which absolutely destroys her husband, though he has to deal with it because you know, she's making money, she's getting along, she's getting a hell of a reputation. So there things start colliding. And I'm not going to, when she starts her business with another man who is as strong and determined as she is, in the process of doing all this and being just sucked into the energy and the demands of it, she forgot a couple of things. Nadra forgot a couple of things. I'm not going to tell you what she forgot, and I'm not going to tell you the results, because I want you to read the book, and it's best determined through the book or through the book itself. So to know more, you must read the book. In the process, you're going to learn a lot about Catholic education. You're going to learn a lot about Syrian music. You're going to learn a heck of a lot about Syrian food because Nadra is superb at it and can do it all. And you're also going to learn a lot about the enduring strength of women who help and work together. And some of those key figures are in there. So that's generally what it's about. What I can do is give you, I don't want to use too much time reading excerpts from the book, but I can read a little bit of them to give you a flavor if you'd like, or we can proceed into a discussion. Would you like me to read short excerpts? Okay. This one, this one is called Dalla. Dalla was one of Nadra's best friends. She was one of 3 best friends. She is the oldest of the best friends. And when Nadra says to her, I don't know if I can stand it anymore. Because Nadra has come into a typical Syrian family at that point, who has the husband's mother living with them. The husband's mother is called Hanna. Is just the word mother. So Hanna just means mother of John. Well, Nadra didn't realize that she was getting John and his mother for the rest of her lifetime. Hanna, in Nadra's point of view, looks like some kind of a watchtower. She's always watching her. She knows about her, etc. Consequently, Nadra goes to Dalla and says, I don't know if I can take any more of this. I'm having to deal with all these situations with her, etc., etc. And Dalla simply says to her, you're going to figure it out, Nadra. You're going to figure it out. And then I'm going to read you the passage of where Nadra figures it out, and Nadra figures out not only how to deal with Hanna, but also how to deal with the Syrian patriarch, Isaac. Isaac, or I'm blanking on my own character's name here for a minute. Uncle Ike. Uncle Ike has to be dealt with too, because Uncle Ike is the person who decides how the family is going to be run. It's not John, it's Uncle Ike. The other person who collides with Uncle Ike is his sister, who is Hanna. So they've got an aunt and an uncle pushing them around. So Nadra decides that maybe Dalla could be right. I'm going to read you a couple of passages which give you some idea of what Uncle Ike was like. Maybe she's right. Maybe she is going to figure it out. Perhaps she could pretend to be like Dalla, patient, kind, and soft-spoken and helpful. She decided to change and learn how to use them as Dalla told her to do. Her frowns and gestures, this is Nadra's frowns and gestures, became smiles. She managed warm good mornings to Hanna. Several times she had George take food to Umbel's place. Then she suggested that John invite Umbel to dinner. On that occasion, Umbel put down his fork long enough to announce his new entrepreneurial scheme: potato chips. Potato chips? John, her husband, asked. Yes, potato chips. Everybody buys cons from Zanesville, John said. Nadra replies, John, Umbel is not talking about regular potato chips. He's talking about Syrian potato chips. Uncle Ike says, these will be special, Uncle Ike said as he took another helping of kippy. Umbel emphasized his next sentence with a wave of his fork. Fresh, homemade by hand. Nadra beamed. Syrian potato chips, John. John squinted at her. John squinted at her. She patted his hand and handed him the salad. Smiling sweetly, Nadra said, that's a lot of work. Perhaps George is their oldest son. Perhaps George could help you. He could learn from you, Umbel. So she's setting up a situation here. John almost choked on the olive he had placed in a wad of Syrian bread. Yes, it is my plan to teach him. He's likable and he has a good mind, like the Hanun mind. I will teach him business and Arabic. Ike had a storefront on Noble Street that he used for his business, though there was no sign of his business on the front. On the inside, he had a potato peeler that he cranked by hand, plus a potato slicer apparatus. Before George arrived from school, he would have the sliced potatoes in a stoneware crock filled with water. Upon George's arrival, Hummel would start up the French fryer. Once the chips were cooked, he spread them out to cool on a wooden table covered with oilcloth. George sat at the table, filled the bags, and handed them to Uncle Ike. He sealed them and put them in a box. If George did anything incorrectly, like putting too many chips into a bag, Uncle would gently tap his hand. All the time George was filling the bags, and I hope you can still hear me good. I can only hold this and keep this book down, which is binding me here. All the time George was filling the bags, Ammel was instructing him in Arabic. He only spoke Arabic the whole time. Aleph, Ba, Ta, Zeen, Ha, he would intone. And George repeated each of the 29 letters of the alphabet after him. Once he mastered the alphabet, he practiced the vowels and consonants. Open your mouth as if you were saying ah, and make the sound at the back of your throat. Sabah, good morning. Tayyib, okay. Each time George opened his mouth, he threw a potato chip in. Eventually, I planned to teach him to read and write Arabic. For pay, he could eat all the chips he wanted. George always took a bag of potato chips home for Aurelia. After production, Ammel Ike launched distribution and sales, but he soon tired of walking all over town to peddle his potato chips to grocers and owners of the gambling and beer joints. So he made an addition to George's duties. Okay, how much? Was George's response. What do you mean? Ammel said. You expect me to do it for free, to distribute for free? I'm educating you. You said free isn't a word in the Arabic language. You get to eat all you want, and you always take home some with you. Let's settle on a per bag price, Ammel Ike. I can't afford that. Sidling closer, George spoke softly. I won't tell them, Uncle Ike, about the woman, the lady who didn't answer the door when I took dinner to your place. You know, when you were not there, I left the food. Then I hid and watched until she opened the door and picked it up. Curbing his anger, Ammel said, 2 cents a bag. Incredulous George said, no, Ammel. Okay, so that's one example of the interchange among characters. Now, I can read you other samples, but assuming maybe you prefer a discussion, it's up to you. The other sample readings I have are about the ethnic group of men that John was a part of when he first came to this country. He came into Lowell, Massachusetts, or he came into Boston and then settled in Lowell, Massachusetts, and became one of the mill workers in those days. And he was there for many years before he married Nadra. So those people appear again when John moves to this new town, because they have moved there too. The mills were closing in New England because the mills in the South were taking over. Consequently, people like John and others like him from a variety of ethnic groups couldn't find work, or work wasn't as good. So they began moving into other areas, and many of them moved to West Virginia. So the Ohio Valley and this entire area here, and when you talk about Parkersburg, West Virginia, and you talk about Charleston, and you talk about Huntington, and a lot of those other areas. That's where a lot of these people moved to. And eventually, many of them worked as what I would call pack peddlers. They used to pack up various things that they were selling, and they would go into Appalachia in a great variety of areas. Remember, this was before we had Sears Roebuck and the Sears catalog. You have to remember that. We used to rely, some of us, or at least I'm old enough to remember when my mother relied on the Sears Roebuck catalog. And those people didn't have that prior to this time. Consequently, the pack peddlers, many of whom were Syrian Americans or Lebanese Americans or a variety of nationalities, would pack up their wares and they would go into whatever remote district or not so remote district of Appalachia and that whole Ohio Valley area. The people at that time loved that. Kids felt like it was Christmas when a pack peddler came and laid out all of the stuff on the ground. So eventually, the Sears catalog and Sears generally becomes the big deal, just as Coca-Cola and a lot of other things become a big deal. So my novel is also pretty much a historical novel in which I talk about the things that were going on at that time, so that you get a sense of things that you knew either through your mother or directly yourself. I knew these things because I grew up in that era, and you know, my mother went to the Sears Roebuck catalog. Eventually I did too, for things. So you learn about those. You learn about the beginning of Coca-Cola. You learn about the early Catholic schools. You learn about the nuns in the early Catholic schools, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a historical novel in that sense, and it moves up to the Korean War and stops there. It does not go beyond that point. So it gives you an idea of the times and the places and the kind of people that were there. And many of these Syrian people, some of them started out as pack peddlers, many of them worked in the factories, and eventually they were very good at saving up their money. When they saved up enough, they tried to start their own business. They might start a store, they might start a grocery or whatever. Many of the people that I grew up with, their families started as grocers, or eventually they were able to buy some property, et cetera, et cetera. And then you had the emergence of really of the rich development of the United States through immigrants in the 1950s. I mean, folks, the immigrants did it all, which is one of the things when I'm watching PBS and I'm hearing about all this stuff, I want to scream, blankety blank blank, the immigrants were doing it that many years ago, and we had a resurgence of things then. So that gives you some background. Now, eventually, to return to this book as a love story, the book centers itself on the moves that Nadra decides she has to make in order to survive. She's been a good wife, a good mother. She even took care of her mother-in-law, who she couldn't stand. She took care of Uncle Ike, who she couldn't stand. And eventually, Uncle Ike even comes around to her. But now it's time to take care of Nadra. And as she begins doing so, the story takes some other catastrophic possibilities. And Nadra has to deal with them. But Nadra is a smart cookie and learns how to deal with them. And I'm not going to tell you any more than that. So where do you want to go with this now? Do you want me to read more excerpts? Do you want to talk about the immigrant experience?
I would be interested in hearing the process of you writing the novel, research you might have done, how you published it, like
Okay.
your process. idea? Is this based on someone in your family?
Partly. The book has some, definitely has some autobiographical roots, there's no doubt about that. That's because I needed to come to a resource that I knew intimately, and that was, you know, my own life.
When did you are born in the United States,
Right.
but your parents came from Syria.
Right. My parents were immigrants. I and all my brothers were born in the United States. Okay.
And why did they come to the United States?
They came principally in those times because they were avoiding the Turks. What the Turks were doing was they were taking Syrian men into the army, whether they wanted to be in it or not. Consequently, many of them were avoiding conscription. They had to get the hell out of Syria, and many of them did.
So when was that?
Pardon?
When was that? When did your parents
That was in the early 19th, late 19th and early 20th century.
So when your parents came, when was that?
My parents came over about 1922. Yeah. So, you know, I had done writing mainly short story, and then I switched over to drama, etc. And had a little bit of success there, and then decided that, and writing plays and so forth, and short stories, I was very often using my background, which my mentors were saying to me, my God, that's a rich background, keep using it, and I did. Question?
Yes, how do you spell Umhanda? Mother of John?
Okay, it's U-M, which is the word for mother. Hanna is H-A-N-A, which
Thank
is just Arabic for John.
Thank
Okay. So anyway, I had been using my background, and then at a certain point in my writing career, I decided it was too tough trying to get plays produced. Though I've written, I think, 3 plays now that deal with my background. And I was very often getting into that finalist stage, you know, and I get these letters saying, you were a finalist, blah, blah, blah. And I want to say, yeah, great, but I want to get the next step. Well, I wasn't getting to the next step, so I was still writing, and I decided, well, I'd do a novel. I had a hell of a time, folks. I didn't know how to write a novel, though I had written one with a friend earlier. I didn't think it was any good. She thought it was terrific. But anyway, so it took me ages just to get the thing together and to get my head together with it. I must have spent 3 years trying to figure that out. And then I did. And it began flowing. And then I got a great developmental editor with this outfit that was willing to publish my book, who said, this thing has great possibilities, but you need 2 rewrites on it. One through my help going through A, B, and C, and then another one. Well, many of my friends only needed 1 rewrite. I needed 2, but I knew I needed 2. I didn't have to be convinced. So I began that process. And under his guidance, because he asked me all the right questions and pushed me in the right ways, I did the rewrite. And he said, this is fantastic. It's like 2,000% better than when I first saw. Just make these few adjustments. Now, editors always tell you that BS. Just make these 2, 3 adjustments. Those 2, 3 adjustments, you know, you go through a crisis of the soul trying to figure out how to do some of that stuff. But I got through it. And then we were ready to publish, and he called me up and he said, and this guy was so dear and so polite, he said, what would you think about changing the title? The original title was Nadra's Dilemma. And I said, changing it to what? Now, I called it Nadra's Dilemma because that's what it is. Nadra had to determine at the key point in her life what the hell she's going to do with it. And he said, we're thinking that you should call it Sister of Sonoya. My reaction was, huh? And then I asked for an explanation, and they explained that this is the name of the town and the shrine and blah, 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 blah. And we have this immigrant crisis going on, and if you put thus and thus in it, you'll have more success, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I bit into it. I regret it now, but I can't do much about it. But to my mind, it's still Nadra's Dilemma. It's a historical novel focusing on Nadra, and it is Nadra's Dilemma. And I think she had a great way of figuring it out. So now, where else would you like to go with this? Yes.
When you're doing a second rewrite, is that when you start all over again, or what do you do in the second
No,
rewrite?
he went through, and you know, there's nothing better than working with the good developmental editors because they're the ones who really know. I mean, your best friend, your mother, is not the one to tell you how to correct something. He went through it chapter by chapter and line by line, and you know, wrote a critique saying this works, this works, this works. What do you mean, etc. So I got. I eventually got several pages, you know, where he went through it chapter by chapter and made suggestions. And my task was to go over it and do it again. And when I had that help, I understood when he gave me the critique, I understood what he was saying, and I understood what I needed to be doing. Which is why this person says in his own book to writers, don't trust what your mother says. Don't trust what your husband says. They're going to say nice things to you. Get a developmental editor. Get somebody who knows about publishing. And this is true. This is true. You need that. And that's where you get the truth. Yes.
So you didn't self-publish, you had a publisher?
Yeah, I published through, I'm blanking on everything now. I published through Boyle and Dalton.
And do they charge you a fee up front till you get the
Oh,
book?
yeah, and Boyle and Dalton is a kind of self-publisher. It's called hybrid publishing. Yeah, I ended up having a double the fee because I needed double the work, you know, in terms of improvement.
I have a question. You talked about Syrian and Catholics. I would have thought that Syrian Christians were Orthodox and not Catholic.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't understand everything you said.
I would have thought that Syrians were Orthodox Christian and not Catholic.
Some of them are, many of them are Orthodox Christians. In fact, I'm amazed at how many different denominations of Syrians there are. You have the Orthodox, and there are many of them, and I use the Orthodox rite as a basis for a play that I wrote a number of years ago, which turned out to be a comedy, which worked very well. There are Maronite Catholics. There are 4 or 5 groups that I just learned of recently, and I learned of them recently because at my church, St. Andrew's, they ran out the church at 4:30 on Saturday night for their rituals. And I learned a lot of interesting things. I thought I had some understanding of Arabic, but when I attended a Maronite church, a Maronite mass, I didn't understand a word, not a word. So there are several denominations.
Do you think that maybe the initial immigration population turned to the Catholic Church when they arrived here because it was close to what they knew as an Orthodox tradition, and there likely weren't as many Orthodox congregations available
Well,
to them?
exactly, but what happened I was originally born in Parkersburg, West Virginia, what happened in Parkersburg, when many of the Syrian people immigrated there was no formal Syrian church, Orthodox, Mennonite, or anything. There was a Catholic church, and so they said, okay, that'll do.
Yeah.
So they became Syrian Catholic. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What was the, I don't know Syria at all, so
Okay.
I see it on the news. What's the prime language there that they speak? Because you said you didn't understand it. I don't understand Latin, so,
Well, it's Arabic. It's Arabic.
oh,
Yeah. And, you know, with the, well, when I grew up, Arabic was what I heard at home because that's what they were most comfortable with. And I knew some Arabic as a kid, but I didn't, once I went off to college, I didn't retain much of it. I should have. My oldest brother was a marvelous Arabic speaker to the point where he could tell stories of lion Arabic ad infinitum. He was very good at it, but I didn't retain much. I can recognize some parts of it. That's it.
and I'm only third generation. My grandparents are from Italy. And the only problem in the news that they don't differentiate is it's illegal immigration. That's what they're talking about. Immigrants, yes, all immigrants have had a struggle, whether they're Irish, Italian, Mexican, Black, whatever, everyone who's immigrated here. The point that you're in the politics is legal.
Yeah, that is a big point. And, you know, I think you have to distinguish from in terms of what you know about the news yourself and who you're hearing as your resources. I know I don't go to anything but PBS now to hear what I feel is somewhat close to the truth. I don't, and I'm not getting enough from Channel 4 and Channel 6 to, you know, increase my education on the whole thing. So, the whole thing on immigration is a biggie now, and it's one of the reasons they wanted me to change my title. I don't know if it really did me any good, frankly. Who knows? I don't, well, I don't know. All of you people were here, maybe it helped. I mean, how do you distinguish these things? Other questions?
Is there still much influence of Syrian influence in West Virginia and Parkersburg area?
Is what?
The Syrian influence, is there much still in the Parkersburg area?
As far as I know, it's declining. I think I have a cousin in Parkersburg, for example, and he was in politics and so forth. I don't think there are many of the old timers left, so what you have are the few sons and daughters, but I can't answer that question very well in terms of Parkersburg. I know in places like Charleston and Huntington, you have a bigger, more intense Syrian population. I remember when my cousin got married, and that's been 25 years ago in Huntington, and the bishop at that point, who was a Syrian young man that I grew up with, Father Sadie, was the Monsignor there, and the Monsignor was there for his mass, and I felt like I got hit with Syrian culture, food, mentality, etc., that I had never experienced in the 20 years before, and that's because they've got a big population of Syrians in the bigger places like Huntington and Charleston. In Parkersburg, that sort of thing is dwindling a bit. I can't tell you how much because, well, I always wanted to get out of Parkersburg. It was a little too set in its ways for me. I was a young kid who had to get out, so I wasn't venerating things enough at the time.
So where'd you go?
Well, I got myself to college, Wheeling College in Culural, West Virginia, because I got a scholarship there. and then eventually ended up in 2 other Catholic Jesuit schools. And so when you're ensnared by the Jesuits, you tend to go that route. I mean, I adore them. They're a rough group. You get one heck of an education, but they'll kill you in the process. So, but it's worth it. So that's how I got out of Parkersburg, and then you wouldn't think ending up in Wheeling and then ending up in Cleveland is that much of a change, but it was for me. You know, I was a kid who lived on Route 50 and was raised there, so it was a big deal for me.
And how many years did you teach at Ohio Dominican?
Oh, I was there for a long time. I think close to 25 years.
25 years, and you taught in humanities and
I taught humanities, taught English. I ran the academic center, which was a health support center, an academic health support center for students. So,
and you had a
Where is-
radical president.
Where is
Sister Mary Andrew
Parkersburg?
Matesi.
pardon?
You had a radical president, Sister Mary Andrew Matesi.
Oh, she was. She was something else. She was something. And what she did for the college, nobody has managed to do as well since, from various problems.
Diversity was her gift of inviting so many different diverse groups into that college, now university.
Right, and you see, what she was looking for were students like me, who grew up in the smaller towns, didn't have money to go to college, wanted to go to college, had some incentive, and she brought them in. And it proved to be a blessing, it proved to be a difficulty, because if you've got a kid who's got a lot of trouble with English composition and mathematics, well, what you do is you set up a place called an academic center, which I was told to run when I first started working there. It helped those kids get through. And to a certain extent it was. For some students it was not. That's the reality of it. But she was a forward thinker, and she knew how to keep that college on budget. I mean, there were times when it was dicey, but she kept it going, because she hasn't been able, but I don't know that that's true anymore. As my understanding is they've got a big debt to pay on it now. So, did you have a question in the back?
No, it's already been answered. She did a great job. Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
I was just going to bring out the story of your connecting the two of you today after how many years?
Well, close to 45 years since I've seen Roseanne.
Yeah.
And when she came down into the painting class and said, today our speaker is Ann Kallister. I thought, it's the same Ann Kallister. But our husbands both taught for OU at the Lancaster branch. And yeah, and so we did things together at that time, and then things changed for both of us. And so I didn't see, I didn't know what happened to Roseanne. I didn't know where she went. And at the beginning, I knew that she had written a play at that time, and that you had moved to Columbus, but I didn't know more than that. And so today is the first time I've seen her in all those years, since the mid-70s. And so it's quite exciting to just kind of reconnect and know that she's doing things. So I had to come up, I didn't know if I could even stay this long. I came up while I was still in painting class and got a book because I wanted to make sure I got that and read the first story. So.
It's a great meeting, huh? Amazing.
Any other questions or comments? I have, if you want to look at any of those handouts there, you can certainly. And if you're interested in the book, it is available in digital copy too, if you use that, so.
And where is that available? Because I'm a Kindle reader.
I beg your pardon?
Where is the digital book? Is it on Amazon or?
Yeah, it's on Amazon. All copies are on Amazon.
And you were telling me before we started the session that you have interesting ethnic roots. Tell us about it.
It's just my grandparents were immigrants from Mexico.
You want to say nice and loud here?
Sorry. My grandparents are Mexican immigrants into El Paso, Texas.
El
And
Paso.
that's where I spent a little bit of my childhood, and we would go back and forth to Mexico. And, we would go back and forth to Mexico and El Paso, and it just influenced how I experience life now. Honestly, like having that dual experience, seeing each side, and now it's a lot harder to go to Mexico and come back. It's a lot harder, and there's a lot of tension. But I think seeing it when I was younger really opened my eyes to it. And my grandparents were illegal immigrants, yes. But, you know, they contribute greatly to the community. They pay taxes, they pay Social Security. You know, I think there needs to be a better path to citizenship, an easier path to citizenship, because they're people, you know, like people need somewhere safe to be, to raise their families. And if they can have an opportunity to that rather than suffering, then I think we should make it easier.
Well, thank you for that. El Paso is certainly in the news, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Now it's dangerous. It's very dangerous. But my father recently moved back because my grandmother's getting older. So my father recently moved back to live with her.
You know, Sister Barbara Kane just came back from their Dominican sister. Several spent quite a bit of time at the border and working through the dilemmas.
Right.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and another dilemma, I was wondering what you were thinking about. Are we withdrawing from Syria? Is the United States being called by President Trump to withdraw? How is that going?
Well, as I understand it, he wanted the United States troops to be withdrawn. And then the general said, no, 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 this is not the time to leave. We've just about gotten ISIS under wraps here. This is not the time to be leaving Syria. And then you have the usual Trump explanation. But the military did not want them to leave. And the feeling is that if they leave, then ISIS is going to come back. In fact, from what I'm hearing and getting into reading, ISIS will definitely come back. They're marshaling their forces now. They couldn't deal with the help that the American military were given. So if the president pulls the troops out, I figure it's probably going to be a lost cause in Syria. I figure the Syrian people are going to get decimated. I mean, half of them, more than half of them have been killed off anyway. If you read these stats, you know, it's like 200,000 have been murdered or have been killed or dying or whatever. And so, you know, the reality is there, and the reality is what our president's understanding and decisions are and what the militaries are not the same.
And you must feel that, because these are your people, your roots.
Well, I feel that, and I have a hard time when I'm trying to market my book. I do blogs, which I send out occasionally, and I haven't recently done a lot of blogs because I've had this thing with my hand. I had what was called a cervical action. In other words, something happened to my neck, and I ended up with carpal tunnel syndrome. And if I look funny wearing only one earring, it's because I couldn't manage it with the second earring out in. That's why.
Never noticed.
Yeah, I couldn't get it in there and I was losing it and I already lost 2 earrings, so I thought, well, the heck with it, 1 earring can replace 2. And then-
But
and
isn't
the
that the
ring-
latest, 1 earring?
And the ring
Yeah.
latches, so that's what I'm gonna go with. Anyways, that's, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question. Because, I mean, if you want to talk about politics, who heads up Syria? Is there a president of Syria?
The president of Syria is Anwar Bashar, and he is a fairly young man, I think in his 50s now, maybe in his 60s with a family. His father, who I think had the same name, ruled Syria for over 40 years, and he was a real despot. He kept Syria strong, but he was also murdering his own people if they didn't go along with him politically. This young man, Anwar Bashar II, is worse than his father. For him to have control, and you see, he's being manipulated by the Iranians and by the Russians, and he's being backed by them. So for that reason, Syria is a power draw for a number of those nations, which is why I passed this map around, so you get an idea of where Syria is, and when you look at it, you see Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Sinai, Lebanon, Egypt, etc., Turkey. You see that they're right. Syria is just a tiny nation in a hotbed of all that's going on. And nobody gives 2 damns about the Syrian people. They want political control. And Bashar, the president, is getting it because the Russians have already bought him. And the Iranians and the Russians, they're all warring against each other. They want it. And I don't know why. Is it because there's a lot of oil there or what? But it's in the middle of everything. It's a good target. So, you know, the business about I can't remember the big thing about, the weak and the poor and the impoverished getting more and more intimidated. It's a good example. To my mind, it's an example of evil. It really is. I feel very strong there.
And your side comment, it may be a matter of oil.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe more the central comment.
Well, it's going up to 1 o'clock. My meter expired.
Are we past 1 o'clock? We're just getting caught up in this wonderful. Oh, well, thank you.
Time flies when you're